Hello, everybody. Hello. What a wonderful sight. So many of you on a beautiful evening in October, coming to listen to what will, I hope, be a very interesting, well, I'm sure will be a very interesting topic. How Europeans saw the world and Europe, global perspectives on European cooperation since 1918. It's an interesting topic, and one I was very keen for our speaker this evening, Anne-Isabelle Richard, to talk about. Anne-Isabelle is a university lecturer from Leiden, from the humanities faculty. We have a partnership agreement with Leiden University, as some of you may know. It's one of Europe's most distinguished universities, and they have a degree in international relations from a humanities perspective. And her research interest, so she's from the partner school. She's here for the remainder of the week. She's been here for a week already. Please stop her and say hello if you meet her in the corridors. Her research interests are European and world history from a transnational and trans-imperial perspective. Now, this is the kind of thing we do at SAIS all the time. That was meant as a joke. But focusing on the top concept of regions, she's particularly interested in civil society and how ideas about alternatives to the nation state were negotiated in day-to-day practice from the late 19th century really to the present day. She's co-editor-in-chief of a Cambridge University journal, Itinerario, and part of the editorial board of another journal, Revue Monde. She co-chairs the Humanities Advisory Table of the Dutch Research Council, no small feat, as anybody who's ever chaired a university committee can tell you, and is co-chair of the steering committee of the European Network in Universal and Global History. Her work's been published in the Journal of Global History, Transactions of the Royal Historical Society. I was interested to see the European Review of History, and she contributed an important chapter to the Cambridge History of the European Union and has co-edited a book on maps that made history, which is an extremely interesting topic. So her work is arguing for a global turn in European history. And I'm sure this is an expression that we will hear in this talk, a global turn in European history. What does it mean to have a global turn in European history? And equally, the incorporation of Europe in colonial and global history. She focuses on ideas of imperial, regional, and global construction and belonging from the late 19th century onwards, as I've already said. I think I'd just like to say welcome to SAIS. Just ask you to talk for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll throw it open to questions.
Great. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Let me sort of time myself. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk to you all. I've talked to some of you already. Someone will talk later this week. What I will talk to you about today is something that I've been working on for slightly too long. The paper is similar to the chapter that you kindly referred to in the Cambridge History of the European Union. And it's also based on a manuscript that I'm finishing. And in that manuscript, I use a transnational, trans-imperial approach to highlight national particularities within the global perspective, showing how the influence of colonial thought on European cooperation initiatives played out differently depending on national context. I do that a bit less in the paper, but that's the bigger story, and happy to elaborate on that in the Q&A. Now, I thought most of you are probably more contemporary and more interested in the contemporary, in the contemporary period. So I thought I'd start in the present, and we hear a lot of talk of a changing world order, and we hear many nationalist and Eurosceptic narratives that are presented as an answer to the uncertainty that some people feel. From the other end of the spectrum, the interwar period is often referred to as an example of what a nationalist inward turn can lead to. Now, in this talk, I want to talk about another reaction in the interwar period, where the fear of a change in Europe's position in the world did not lead to a turn to nationalism, but where that fear led significant groups to explore European cooperation. And whereas this turn to Europe can still be understood as an exclusionary reaction, as I'll show, it was also rooted in a profoundly, if still paternalistic, internationalist mentality. So for me, European cooperation didn't start on the 9th of May 1950 with the Schuman Declaration or in the aftermath of World War II. We talked about this Thursday in your class. And this is what the benign narrative of the EU tends to suggest. And one of the essential parts of that narrative is that the EU is an organization sui generis and that it all started after World War II. So it's based on the argument that something fundamentally changed after World War II. You also see that in the German Stunde Null, or how the UN emphasized the fundamental break between the League of Nations and its own creation. Now, all of these narratives emphasize the novelty of their endeavors and the break with the preceding violent 20 years crisis, to use E.H. Carr's term. Now, the post-1945 literature often feels obliged to provide a nod to the interwar period. They reference Pan-Europa founder Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi or French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand as European visionaries. And here's a picture of them both. They're sitting in the middle. Briand is the one with the impressive moustache, and Kalergi is the very young one. And both sitting in the middle of the sofa. Now, this nod in this post-45 literature implicitly confirms a novelty narrative. And the historiography on interwar European cooperation, however, has nuanced that narrative. Not in providing a teleology, but in mapping out longer developments and sometimes also continuities. Now, recent historiography on European integration after 1945 has also been nuancing the benign narrative. And one way this is being done is in highlighting the imbrication of European integration in particularly African colonialism, which is generally not very well acknowledged in the EU's story. So in this talk, I build on these two literatures, and I argue that the main rupture that caused a significant shift in the thinking about Europe that led to concrete proposals for European cooperation was World War I, and that we can only understand this if we take a global perspective. And as a result of this global perspective, the colonial dimension of European projects and narratives, as well as perspectives on developments in Africa and Asia, play a significant role. War and peace were catalysts for a structural change taking place since the turn of the century. As French publicist Georges Duhamel put it, quote, "It was during the war that we became very conscious of what Europe was and what it represented in the world," unquote. After World War I, the position of Europe in the world changed profoundly, and an intense sense of crisis swept across Europe. The Great War created this existential shift in the thinking of significant groups of politicians, businessmen, civil servants, journalists, public intellectuals across Europe. And I mention these groups specifically here as they exemplify the overlap and connections between state and non-state actors. And I want to point out that these people fulfilled these roles sometimes simultaneously, sometimes consecutively, but this was a bigger network, and we need to take that into account. While you can see them as a network, their motives and objectives differed, ranging from the more political and economic to more cultural affinities. But a common factor amongst many of these initiatives was a preoccupation with the position of Europe in the world on all of these terrains. And you might be familiar with Oswald Spengler's Untergang des Abendlandes that came out in the aftermath of World War I, but there are multiple other examples, as you can see on the slide here. Now, this was not just a result of the war in Europe. You know, the war in Europe was terrible, but it was also the result of developments in other parts of the world. Concerns of the rise of the United States, the creation of the Soviet Union, the growing economic and political importance of the British dominions, Latin America, as well as the rise of Japan, were coupled with fear about the large-scale unrests that were spreading around the colonial world. And particularly these latter fears were linked to the future of European colonial empires, and with that to the future and standing of Europe in the world. So when we look at it from this perspective, it becomes clear that many interwar actors argued for various forms of European cooperation, inspired both by their experience of the Great War in Europe and a form of existential fear that Europe might lose its position at the top of the geopolitical, economic, civilizational, and racial ladder. The rise of the extra-European world provided a rationale for European cooperation. In turn, European colonies, in particular the African colonies, were seen as essential to European recovery. So there's these two sides that are paradoxical. And within a changing world order, calls for European cooperation in the interwar period were therefore aimed at maintaining a global status quo. Now, the period after 1945, I touched upon it before, is often seen as the period when the big shift in Europe's global position took place, and as a result, when solutions to these challenges needed to be found. Now, I argue that these changes were already underway and that already in the interwar period, answers to these existential questions were being discussed. And without an understanding of these discussions, the answers of the post-1945 period can't really be understood. So I'm not drawing a teleology, but I'm saying that you can't understand those answers if you don't understand the discussions to the same question before. So I will take a global view to examine colonial thought in Europeanist circles for four interlinked reasons. To fully understand the fundamental challenge from all corners of the globe that was felt already at the end of World War I, how the idea of Europe in civilizational and in racial terms was heavily informed by non-European interactions, how Africa and Asia came to be understood differently, and thus why Euro-Africa became relevant, and I'll get to this at the end of my talk, and also who advocated for which type of European project. I'll only hint at this, but I'm happy to elaborate in the Q&A. Because for some, the colonial community of interest was the reason why a united Europe would be impossible. For others, colonial ties were no less important, but it was a reason why it was necessary to integrate overseas territories in a European project. And here it becomes interesting where we differentiate between countries. So what it meant to be European wasn't just defined or understood in relation to what was happening in Europe. It was also a result of developments elsewhere in the world. And I'll use four frameworks to show this: geopolitics, economics, civilizational ideas, and racial beliefs that played a predominant role in the writings of many Europeanists across Europe. They all put different emphasis, but aspects of the same frameworks can be found in almost all of their conceptions of global order and the role of Europe and European states in that order. Now, in analyzing the writings and projects of both state and non-state actors, I'll give you a sense of the plurality of Europeanist projects explored and launched in the interwar period, as well as indicate the continuity between interwar and post-war period. By understanding European cooperation projects as possible answers to the question of how to deal with a changing global order, we can also nuance these exceptionalist arguments about European cooperation. So I'll start with a quote. "These days, Europe is no longer the political, the economic, or the cultural center of the world. The world has emancipated itself from Europe." This quote, excuse me, by Richard Kaunhofer-Kalergi immediately indicates the relevance to European cooperation of the four frameworks I just mentioned. So in the rest of the talk, I'll analyze these frameworks in turn before sketching the role of Euro-Africa in European cooperation. And I use examples from across the European movement, French and Dutch sources are well represented due to the fact that they were both important continental colonial powers and later part of the original six, but with empires that were quite different in terms of location between Africa and Asia, and also economic approach. And this difference makes it possible to present a range of viewpoints rather than suggesting this very hermeneutic argument. Now, Coudenhove-Kalergi is also well represented, and he's often portrayed as very exceptional. But the reason of why he's of interest to me is the opposite. Like many of the actors examined in this paper, he was an intermediate thinker. He was not a systemic thinker like Kant or Hegel. His views were very eclectic. He borrowed from everyone. And at the same time, he was this great propagandist who also antagonized many people. There were people who really hated him with a vengeance. Thus, he became a point of reference, positively or negatively. And why I'm interested in him is that his ideas can be seen as representative of a sort of spirit of the age. So this talk is also a form of more intellectual history in practice, exploring how ideas were negotiated in day-to-day practice rather than focusing on very systemic thinkers. So let's start with geopolitics. At the start, I mentioned a number of geopolitical developments that influence the thinking about European cooperation. And these ideas about the rise of other centers of power and the need for Europe to cooperate are illustrated in the map that Coudenhove used very widely, which you can see here. On this map, Coudenhove divided the world into 5 force fields: Pan-Europe with its colonies, the British Empire, Soviet Union, East Asia, and Pan-America. And Coudenhove was certainly not alone in seeing the world like this. In 1929-1930, the French magazine The Revue des Vivants, the survivors of the First World War, incidentally, ran a contest about how to organize the peoples of Europe. Foreshadowing third force ideas from the 1940s, the editors argued that, quote, the time had come for humanity to organize itself in continents, unquote. The United States were very clearly independent of Europe. The awakened Asia had Moscow at its capital, and there was only one guarantee for European nations aiming to protect their heritage, and that was a federation of European states. Now, they received 502 projects from across France and Europe, and this was before social media and everything. So 502 was quite a significant, because also these projects were very elaborate. So people put a lot of time and effort into it. And these projects generally supported this division of the world, although the position of Britain was a point of discussion throughout. And for an elaboration of the position of Britain, the relation between Britain and Europe, we can turn to Leopold Amery, British colonial secretary and member of the Round Table movement and of Pan-Europe. He stressed the growing importance of the dominions, and he argued that the British Empire and Pan-Europe were roughly equal in size. Britain and the dominions combined were similar to the European states, and if they cooperated, and both then had a colonial empire connected to them. If Britain should, could, or would not want to join a European cooperation project because of its empire, it would at least be an ally to Europe. So his argument ran. In the Netherlands, opinion was quite different, or more hesitant at least. And the reason was that the Netherlands were strategically and economically dependent on the British Empire, both in Europe and in Asia. So this difference gives you a bit of a sense of how empire played a role in who supported what kind of project. While more grassroots Dutch activists followed Coudenhove's model, more high-profile actors tended to argue for the inclusion of Britain in any European project until the early 1930s at least, because then Britain adopted imperial preference and then everything changed. Overall, the British Empire played a pivotal role in discussions on British participation in a European project. And, well, I guess the Commonwealth continued to do so up until and after Brexit. In discussions about the position of the Soviet Union, the next force field on the map, the revolution and anti-communism played very important roles. And on the one hand, this was used as an argument to say why Europeans needed to cooperate. On the other, it was also used to say why the Soviet Union could not be a part of a European project. And then the last argument was that, at least according to Coudenhove, the Soviet Union had become a champion of the Asian peoples. And these views together were widely shared across Europe. Well before the start of the Cold War, anti-communism was a very significant factor. And it was so for what it meant within Europe, but also for what it meant in the colonies and for the repercussions that that would have for Europe. So from Europe to the colonies and back. Colonial unrest, communist uprisings, particularly in Asia in the mid to late 1920s, played an important role in arguments about colonial investment and European cooperation of somebody like the French minister Albert Sarraut, here he is, who was a staunch anti-communist and was very aware of connections across Asian colonial empires, both on the communist side, Tim Harper has written about that beautifully, and on the imperial side. So very much a trans-imperial perspective is what helps this analysis. And he was very much aware of what was going on in Indonesia, and that's why I have the Communist Party of Indonesia here. So moving on to the next force field, Pan America. That was regarded as both an inspiration and as a challenge to Europe. The Americans were very much in the public eye in the early 1920s as a result of the role of the US and President Wilson during and after World War I, but also because of the 1923 centenary of the Monroe Doctrine, which in Europeanist circles, which was often, not necessarily correctly, understood as a model for continental organization. And the book by the appropriately named German pacifist Alfred Fried served as inspiration here. Now, Sven Beckert has analyzed the rise of the Americas and the challenge this posed to the existing global order with an emphasis on the period up to the First World War. But these developments were very much amplified by the war. Latin American countries were gaining influence, and their relationship to the US was often compared to the increasingly equal relationship between the Dominions and Britain. Not saying that it was equal, but it was increasingly equal. Now, the threat that the Americas posed was mainly in terms of economic competition. I'll come back to that when I discuss economics, and in cultural terms. It was seen as superficial, commercial, that sort of thing. Now, the most profound challenge to Europe's position in the world came from Asia, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about civilization and race. And while this is not an argument that has been very well developed in the literature on European cooperation, this was of existential importance for many. It has been discussed elsewhere, but not in this context. Japan's victory over Russia in 1905 was a clear turning point. I'm sure you're all aware of that. And this was reinforced by Japan's economic development, its activities in Korea and China, and its position as victor in World War I. Now, the widespread unease, which the often misunderstood Japanese claims for race equality, for race equality at Versailles, and the many anti-immigration laws were further expressions of this yellow peril idea that there's a lot of literature on that, but there is nothing in relation to European cooperation. Moreover, just like the Russian Revolution, the rise of Japan was linked to anti-colonial uprisings across Asia. For Coudenhove, whose mother was Japanese, Japan was becoming a regular great power. For many others, such as the French foreign minister, no, not foreign minister, he was everything but foreign minister, Albert Sarraut, sorry, who I mentioned before, or Dutch Prime Minister and old colonial hand Hendrik Colijn, this was really of great concern. What does this rise of Japan mean for all the colonized peoples across Asia? Now, concern for the rise of Japan was common, but there was much less consensus on the fate of European colonies in Asia. Some, such as Colijn, were concerned about outside influence, from communism, from Japan, or things happening in other colonies. Again, this trans-imperial vision that was very prevalent. And as a result, he argued that if European colonial empires did not cooperate, they would, quote, perish together. Others, such as Coudenhove, went one step further and forecast the end of Europe's colonies in Asia. And this shows two differences. One, how he understood Asia and Africa differently, and I'll get back to that later. And secondly, how colonial empire meant different things to different people. A Dutch person interested in European cooperation with any feeling for Dutch foreign policy would never say this. While not mentioned on Coudenhove's map, the League of Nations played a pivotal role in the thinking of and the planning for a European future on at least three different levels. This was firstly the case in terms of personal connections. Many activists were simultaneously active in the League and in Europeanist organizations and continue to be so after 1945. We can think of Jean Monnet as Deputy Secretary General of the League and later President of the High Authority of the Coal and Steel Community as just one example. Secondly, experiences of the League in how to organize an international bureaucracy and to develop policy are essential to understand future European bureaucracies and policymaking practices. And finally, and most importantly for our purposes here, the League was also pivotal in terms of how European cooperation was conceived of, given that the League of Nations was very much a league of predominantly European nations. So was European cooperation competition or a complement to the League? And that was a very big question. There are sort of three broad approaches that we can discern. Firstly, there were those who saw them as complements. Secondly, there were those who grew increasingly disillusioned with the League and who started to explore European options. And that was, for example, the case of a few Dutch activists. And finally, there were those who'd always been skeptical of the League. And this was especially true for more grassroots activists and for Coudenhove, although there is a very interesting spin in 1936 for Coudenhove. Now, Coudenhove's critique of the League made the pan-European project and European cooperation more generally, because he was so prominent, into an easy target for its critics. It would create antagonisms between continents and constitute competition to the League. So being European could also mean supporting the League and not supporting European cooperation. I think that's something that we tend to forget if we look back with all that we know about the EU. Now, let me turn to the second framework, which is economics. The interwar period saw a very vivid discussion on how economic and political cooperation related to each other. Now, this debate has clearly not ceased since, going from neo-functionalism, EMU, to recent discussions on a fiscal union. This is still there. In the interwar period, this debate came to a head around French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand's speech to the General Assembly of the League in September 1929. September 1929. I'm emphasizing this date. And in that speech, he seemed to put economic cooperation first. Then he was asked to elaborate on this. He developed a memorandum that came in May 1930, so 8 months later. In between, the Wall Street crash happened. And in that second memorandum, he prioritized political cooperation. I can elaborate on probable reasons for this change in the Q&A, but activists and policymakers were very shocked by this, as they generally saw economic union precede political cooperation. So while economic cooperation was prioritized by most, the types of economic cooperation that were proposed ranged quite widely. There were, again, obviously, a number of recurring points, and the starting point was clear. The starting point was the interconnectedness of the world economy. French economist Francis Deleuze explored this theme extensively in his massive work, Contradiction du monde moderne. And he illustrated the contradiction between political nationalism and economic interdependence as follows. The Congo is nothing more than an annex of our car factories. Japan of the samurai is a competitor to Manchester. From the banks of Lake Tanganyika extracts the copper for our telephones. The worker in Rouen weaves the cotton goods for the coolies. The banks of the Mekong, and the French petit bourgeois let his money work on the banks of the Yangtze-Kiang or the nitrate areas of the Cordillera of the Andes. Now, this globalized interconnectedness was clearly a product of the late 19th century. And as Beckett has shown, profound changes were taking place. And after World War I, many of these came to a head. And one of the most obvious changes in Europe was the rise of tariff wars, following the creation of many new nation states. The rise of tariffs was perceived by many as one of the foremost economic problems of the period, and envious eyes were cast on the US with, and this is what they came back to every time and again, its large uninterrupted market. Now, the relationship to colonial empire was not straightforward, as there were many different colonial tariff regimes. The Dutch, for example, practiced an open door policy in the Indies. This meant that they were initially not very enthusiastic about European cooperation because they thought it might compromise their open door, which is actually what you see with the Treaty of Rome happening. Then that would have been impossible. However, as they became increasingly isolated as a low tariff country, the Dutch started to explore other regional alternatives. And the 1932 Convention of Ouchy with Belgium and Luxembourg, I'm sure, I doubt that anybody has ever heard of it, but it's a wonderful thing and it needs more attention, I think, because it provides clear stepping stones to the later creation of the Benelux and the Beyen Plan of the 1950s, which then leads to the Treaties of Rome. And I can talk about why it failed. It was the fault of the British, I'm afraid. Concerns over your words. Concerns over rapid economic development outside of Europe were accompanied by the realization that world trade could flow around Europe, as World War I had proven. The US, the Dominions, Latin America were part of what Deleuze called the Third Europe. And the literature on interwar Europeanism often refers to Deleuze's book, Les Deux Europes. He does it in a particular context. It focuses on the two Europes mentioned in the title, and Deleuze's argument that industrialized Europe, the first Europe, and you can see it here in that circle, and agricultural Europe, the second Europe, complemented each other. But what they don't talk about, and which I think is essential for understanding, is that he only arrived at that argument about the two Europes as a second best solution. He spends 2/3 of that book explaining how he preferred the third Europe. Everywhere where Europeans, and with that he meant whites, could work without the aid of the indigenous population. But since that third Europe was emancipating, the two Europes needed to find a way to work together. And this global reasoning, preferring the third Europe, but since that is emancipating, the two Europes need to cooperate, that's not mentioned at all in the literature. But I think it's necessary to understand his reasoning and also to understand more of these projects for European cooperation. Another major change following World War I took place in the relationship between the state and the economy, with a much larger role for the state following the war experience. And in certain circles, particularly in France, planning became all the rage in attempts to address these economic difficulties. But planning wasn't just a purview of the state. Planning by business leaders was also a very significant component, since some argued that private initiative was superior to state planning. We can think of the International Steel Cartel or the Phoebus light bulb cartel as examples of cartels in which companies participated that supported European cooperation. And again, these experiences, these ideas provided stepping stones for the coal and steel community. And planning was of great importance, not just in Europe, but also in the global sphere. And that's where Eurafrica projects come to mind. I'll get to that. But let me first talk about the third and fourth framework. Now, across the board, all activists agreed that civilization was what defined Europe. Being European depended on European civilization, however that was understood. And there were many discussions about that. But what I want to stress is that they saw it as both important and, well, I want to point out how important it was and also superfluous at the same time to point to this paradox that despite ideas about European decline following World War I, European civilization was still commonly regarded as the most advanced civilization. So it's in decline and yet it's essential. And this understanding was strongly influenced by the thinking of European civilization in relation to non-European cultures, most strongly in a colonial context. Rather than emphasizing the diversity of European culture, as was common in a Euro-European setting, in the colonies, the sameness of European cultures and civilization prevailed. So European civilization as a universal civilization. Now, what about imperial competition, you might ask? Of course, that was there, but still, the confrontation with a non-European other, so-called other, highlighted the common civilization that bound Europeans together. Sometimes this was couched in civilizational terms. These sentiments often drew on discourses about the superiority of the white race. And the perceived contrast between, on the one hand, peoples supposedly living in a state of nature and decadent so-called civilized peoples as suggested by Orientalist discourse, and on the other hand, European modernity worked to reinforce the supremacy of European civilization and the justification for European projects. And at the same time, fears about challenges to that supremacy fed into European projects. And these ideas were based on entwined conceptions of hierarchies of civilization and race. Not all actors involved subscribed to the same understandings, but again, there are broad lines that we can draw. Certain territories were seen as more developed than others. Asia, often understood as encompassing the area from Casablanca all the way to Tokyo, might be seen as decadent, but Japanese, Chinese, Indian, and Muslim culture were generally understood as being part of a civilizational order. And this capacity of civility also entailed a potential danger to European civilization, seen as it was to be in decline. In discussing a book by Sarraut, Grandeur et Servitude, the reviewer in L'Europe Nouvelle made the point that, quote, if Asia awakens, it's necessary that Europe in response unites, unquote. Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, was viewed quite differently from Asia. It was not part of the civilizational map of the world. The African peoples were supposedly backward without history. And as a result, Africa was generally viewed through a racial lens, and the bulk of public opinion regarding Europe's role vis-à-vis the colonized people, and particularly Africans, went between paternalistic and biological racism, none of which was particularly pleasant, clearly. The paternalistic kind of racism was, I think, almost omnipresent in the interwar period, except perhaps in very clear anti-colonial circles, and even there. Modern colonial practice was propagated by many, including the circle around the journal L'Europe Nouvelle. In the literature, L'Europe Nouvelle is generally depicted as a peace and Europeanist journal, but they devoted quite a lot of space to colonialism and argued, for example, that France was, quote, the tutor of the indigenous peoples, unquote, and had to assure itself of their, quote, effective collaboration to develop the still unexplored immense riches of our colonies, unquote. So that's the paternalistic side. French publicist Gaston Rioux is an example of biological racism. One of his books had the telling title, Unite or Perish. He was strongly motivated by ideas about the destiny of the white race. Despite its deficiencies, the white race was paramount because of its, quote, profound and durable humanist values. Well, we can talk a long time about those. But you see sort of the scope of thinking. Coudenhove was somewhere in between those. Some racial theories were problematic for him, with a Jewish wife, a Japanese mother. According to him, there could not be two types of the white race, because the real opposition was between black and white. He did subscribe then to racial theories when it came to Africa. And this is the most well-known expression of that. In relation to Africa, he was convinced that racial solidarity trumped state solidarity. The Belgians, British, French, and Portuguese had to recognize that they were more tightly linked to their, quote, white neighbors than to their black subjects. Now, the combination of these civilizational and racial ideas in relation to Asia and Africa, as well as geopolitical and economic analysis mentioned above and before, meant that while for the time being, Asian colonies were generally included in projects for European cooperation, they were seen differently from the African colonies. And many across Europe anticipated the future emancipation of the Asian colonies and instead promoted Euro-African cooperation. But again, there is a difference from which country activists came. The Netherlands, largest colony in Asia, these ideas were much less supported. And it's important to keep that differentiation in mind when we read the literature on Euro-Africa, which is very Francophone and to a certain extent also Italo-centric. But to give you a sense of the majority of ideas, this is a quote by French politician Joseph Caillaux. I have become convinced that Europe will reconcile itself through Africa. The more I see the retreat from Asia, the chosen isolation of the United States, the more I'm convinced that Africa is the great reserve of raw materials and markets of the Europeans. So let me say a few words on Euro-Africa. And I've deliberately left this to the end. In the academic literature, there's by now quite a bit of attention for Euro-Africa. But this is generally done without this broader global framework, whereas I argue it is this framework that explains why Euro-Africa became so important. Europe and Africa were seen as interdependent and complementary continents in terms of levels of civilization and resources. And rather than thinking of Africa as the continent where the great powers competed to plant their own flag, the advocates of Euro-Africa argued that European states should develop Africa together, and the benefits on many terrains would be enormous. And it's very much standard colonial rhetoric that was used here, but it wasn't applied at the national, but at the European level. These projects came in many guises. Most far-reaching projects argued for a common European government for all African colonies. They built on ideas of the internationalization of colonies, particularly the Congo or the mandates. The least far-reaching projects argued for access for all European citizens and companies, regardless of nationality, to all these European colonies, the so-called European open door policy. Belgian socialist Jules Destrée was a bit in between in proposing an African citizenship for all Europeans so they could have free access, which is also an interesting concept if you think about it from today. And in almost all projects, infrastructure played a huge role. The rationale was that these investments were too big for individual countries, whereas their impact would be enormous for the development of Africa, but for example, also in addressing the unemployment problem. Similar, and well, Sarraut talks about this as well. He wanted to have this huge plan for a mise en valeur of the French African colonies. That didn't happen after the First World War, but he came to support Euro-African plans in the 30s. If joint funding would make these development projects possible, this would benefit the local populations. Yes, it is. This is my conclusion. They would then be less likely to revolt. That's the important thing to remember. And similar reasoning was put forward after the Second World War. So in this talk, I've taken a global perspective to analyze what it meant to be European and to act upon that impulse during the 20 years crisis. The world order was changing profoundly in this period. And if we include non-state actors in our analysis, we see that many in Europe sought solutions to what they felt were the geopolitical, economic, civilizational, and racial challenges from all corners of the world. Europeanists argued that some form of European cooperation would be the best answer, particularly if that cooperation extended to the African colonies. And when the changes underway in this period were further amplified after World War II, and Europe had to come to terms with its changing position even more, a significant number of the answers formulated in the interwar period were repurposed, not just applied, but repurposed to fit the situation of the 40s and 50s. And these findings suggest that both the novelty and benign narratives used by the European Union need adjusting. A global perspective also shows that besides the experience of the war itself and Franco-German relations, developments in other parts of the world played an important role in discussions on European cooperation. And within these, empire was of particular significance, could act as a brake, as in the case of Britain or the Netherlands in the 1920s. But preventing the loss of colonies could also be the reason why Europeans needed to cooperate. And even more importantly, colonial ideologies of civilizational and racial hierarchies were fundamental to European self-perceptions. And these ideologies led to a different understanding of Asia and Africa. Regarding Asia, civilizational aspects predominated, and Asian colonies were seen as time-limited. Regarding Africa, racial aspects dominated. And this difference explains the enthusiasm for Euro-African projects. Euro-African cooperation, in whichever form, would diminish European competition, buttress Europe's global position, both after World War I and after World War II. And these non-European foundations of the European cooperation story, I think, have to be addressed as well in order to properly understand the European project. Thank you.
So you see, European integration doesn't begin with last week's European Council. I'm going to throw the floor open because otherwise I would spend the entire evening asking questions because I have quite a lot. I'll start with Professor Meyer. The rest of you start thinking of questions. And when you do, please give me your name and ask. Hartmut.
Yeah, thank you for an excellent presentation on how the origins of European integration need to be rethought in light of different intellectual traditions. There are two intellectual traditions I want to point out that I didn't hear and ask you how they were interwoven with. One is religion, and how rising anti-Semitism and notions of Europe as a Catholic project, deep medieval ties and so on is interwoven with the histories of political cooperation through institutions and racial notions of empire and so on. The other one is, you mentioned neo-functionalism, but not the functionalism, i.e. the complex interdependence and how integrated economic societies also contribute to that, and whether that is a European or a global phenomena. So the religious history and the economic history, in addition to the political, racial, empire, and so on, how does it all play a part in addition to what you said?
Perhaps you could answer that one while people are still thinking another question.
Okay, so yes, religion. It does and it doesn't play a role. You may know the book by Dina Gushtainova, who talks about these elites. Kaldenova is part of that. And on the one hand, it's there, but on the other hand, you have plenty of socialists who are very anti-clerical. The grandfather of your own rector was one of those. I mean, although it depends how some people, he disagreed with how anti-clerical he was. But anyway, so just to say that it does play a role, and at the same time, it doesn't necessarily. It was quite a broad school. And as you say, there are different strands that come together. All that is very much also the case for the economic argument. And so I pointed to a few business, I said something about businesses. My favorite example, which I already used, I think, in your class, is Philips, the Dutch light bulb company. They supported Pan-Europe from 1923. They were part of the roundtable of industrialists, and they were one of the very few companies that spoke out against Brexit publicly. And the reason why they have always argued for lower tariffs. and for a more integrated market. And I think you see those things coming together. But if you look at the writings and what their worldview is, they, on the one hand, clearly wanted to sell light bulbs. On the other hand, they were also very imbricated in the whole colonial enterprise, because I forget what it is. They were instrumental in setting up the connection to the Dutch East Indies, for example. So they were very much imbricated in this. And I think there are these are things that are interlinked, but I don't think you can completely tease them out. Separate them, sorry. You can't completely separate them and say, well, there was just this economic rational argument and they're not, and there is nothing to do with colonial thought or the basis of colonial thought. So I think that is still there. To come back to the point about religion and anti-Semitism and how Catholicism played a role. I mean, Wolfgang Kaiser has obviously made a huge argument about the Christian Democrats. More so, like from a Dutch perspective, it's, I think, worth putting the point that it's not just Catholics, but also some Protestants. That was there, but to be honest, I think in the interwar period that played less of a role, or less of a role than what Wolfgang has shown for the post period. Which is not to say that it wasn't important. If you think about Visser het Hoofd and all these networks during the war and the resistance, that was clearly very much there. And for some, you could also very easily link this to colonial thought. You know, the white man's burden. It's also a religious idea. About anti-Semitism. Well, I mean, there were people that were biological racists among people who supported this, and there were people who were clearly not. It was a broad school, and I think that is also my other point, that it was quite eclectic, as probably most movements today still are. So I think that's the point about the anti-Semitism. And you had a point about how this was interwoven with European institutions, which I don't think I've answered yet. It's enough.
Please, yes. Person here in the green jumper. Give me your name, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Luc van der Linden. Thank you, Professor Richard, for an interesting talk. I had a question regarding the map of the two Europes, which, funnily enough, seemed to end at around Bologna in Italy. Considering your point, for example, about Italy's view on the Eurafrica project. However, Italy was for large part still seen apparently as part of the second Europe. I was wondering if you could further discuss Europe's view of Italy and world and possibly Italy's view of Europe. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take another one as well, if you like. There was somebody at the back, I can't see who it is. There was first whoever it is at the back, no? Okay, yeah, I can't see whoever's hand it was, I can just see a hand.
Right. Hi, this is Robert Thomas. Of course, a lot of what you have discussed about the European thinking and writing on Europe's position in the world, cultural versus racial relationships with different regions, these weren't closed-door discussions in the halls of power. These were things that were widely published, that were available in the public domain. And I'm curious how some of that was received by audiences outside Europe, whether in Europe's own Asian and African colonies or in places like the United States and Japan. How were these pieces of discourse interpreted more broadly by those audiences, and how did that shape attitudes among those outside Europe towards efforts at European integration?
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you for both these questions. To start with the Italy question, which I almost feel I need to pass on to you, but my 2 cents are that is the line that shows the 2 Italies. I mean, you talk about the 2 Europes. I mean, say there was 2 Italies, and the northern part is very, very well developed, and the southern part is basically like a colony, at least as how it was seen. Can I say that?
Yeah.
So
Wrongly, however, in some ways, one could argue.
I'm not talking about right or wrong. I'm just, how it was perceived. So I guess it's also about and then there are yet further colonies down the line. So how these groups saw Italians. Well, I mean, some of them were very welcome, but there were clearly also representatives of the fascist regime. Up to a point, they were still very welcome. And it also depends who in this broad European church you were talking to. There is this famous Volta Congress in 1936, I think, which took place in Italy, which is basically a reunion of everybody that was very much on the right hand of the spectrum. So I guess also in political terms, there were different Italies. There is the Italy of the Gasperi and why am I forgetting his name? Who wrote the Ventotene?
Spinelli.
Yeah, Spinelli. There is that, but there is also the Volta people. So there were, and the Eurafrica people tended to be more in that group than in the Spinelli group, I think. So there are differences there. So I think also there, on the one hand, I do argue that there are national particularities. At the same time, you need to look under the hood of that nation state and see those differences and also how they were perceived elsewhere. Robert, your point about it's an excellent question. First, one thing about where you say these are published discussions, a lot of it was, but a lot of it is also private correspondence. So, I mean, some of it was open, a lot of it was also just between two people that knew each other very well, or discussions within Council of Ministers, etc. How this was received, that's the million-dollar question. I haven't, oh, sure, yeah, sorry, I'm terrible with microphones. I haven't looked at it for this project. For another project, looking at ideas of Eurafrica, I very explicitly changed the tables and looked at African perspectives on Eurafrica. Now that project, I started and then it died a sad death under COVID travel restrictions. I have looked at it to some extent, and that's more focused on the period just after the Second World War, where you see a lot of African parliamentarians active in, for example, the Council of Europe, and very much using the narrative of Eurafrica for their own purposes, using it as a claim-making technique and saying, hey, you're talking about this wonderful common future. Well, then give us a rise, give us a welfare state, you know, live up to what you say, give us human rights. Well, we talked about this before. So for this, I haven't. In the US, so part of the reason why Briand changed from economics to politics, that has to do with the US, because they were so concerned that the US read this project for economic cooperation in Europe as, think about Trump, basically, as something aimed at the US and a sort of aggressive move. That seems to be the main reason why they changed it to something political, and why everybody in Europe was like, why? What's going on? This doesn't make any sense, as it didn't. But it was a way not to antagonize the US further and to keep the US on board in European affairs. So to that extent, I knew, but otherwise I haven't looked at it, but it's an excellent question, and I would love to do that research. And there is one thing to say, which is that anti-colonial movements, there's more and more literature on these trans-imperial perspectives, and on the one hand looking at how colonial powers looked at each other, but also at how anti-colonial movements work together. I mentioned Tim Harper's book, and there you do get a sense that they were looking at what all these colonial empires were doing. I haven't found references to anything European. The Europeans were very much looking at these Pan-Asian conferences in Nagasaki in 1926, etc.
Can I jump in here just for a second? Because one thing that struck me is, what is it that caused people to start thinking of themselves, at least intellectuals, politicians, the people we're talking about, as being European? Because I was listening to your talk very attentively, obviously, and it could be, was it they had colonies and they developed a sense of not being the colonial peoples? You said that there was a sameness. Is it that they were looking at the Russian experiment? Because one of the things I expected you almost to talk about in this was the way in which Russia was perceived as being a new civilization, to use the Webbs, and so the old civilization reacting against the Russian civilization. America was seen as a new civilization. Henry Ford, think of Gramsci, Americanismo Fordismo, and the fact that it was creating so much more productive than the European model. And question mark. Are these, I mean, are there similar literatures to this that would also feed into this narrative in the 1920s and 30s that would feed into this creation of the European project, so to speak,
Yes.
which is what you're saying. You're
Yep.
saying it starts in the 20s and 30s, not in the 40s and 50s.
I think, no, that's why I started with that map and going around the whole globe, basically. I mean, the talk is very much focused on the colonies and colonial thought, but I mean, my argument is very much also the impetus of the US. We're not the US, they're superficial as well, like this whole cultural idea, and they're overtaking us. And the same, as you were saying, with the Soviet Union, they're creating this new society. Put all of that together. I think that was really, if you put all of that together, that is what really brought these people. It was, I mean, part of it was obviously clearly as well, people having just been fighting each other in the trenches, and this, what they call the mutual suicide, that's clearly there too. But it's also very much like just feeling the pressure from everywhere, and sort of being under pressure sort of led them to think of themselves as European, I would think, because they saw these other models and they were like, well, we need to do something to prevent us becoming irrelevant.
I'd just like to follow up with that. When I was very young, back in the 14th century, I did a lot of work on British intellectuals in the 1930s, people like H.M. Brailsford, G.D.H. Cole, Kingsley Martin, Lasky, the whole New Statesman group, so to speak. New Statesman at the time was the best-selling magazine, intellectual magazine in the world. I mean, it was selling 100, 200,000 copies a week. In 1936, H.M. Brailsford, after the Abyssinia crisis, produced a pamphlet that was called Towards a New League, and argued that European unification within a new league was the only way of creating a counter-democratic dynamic to fascism. I got the impression from listening to what you've been saying here, quite a lot of these people were more sympathetic to more right-wing ideas.
No, actually, I'm very glad you bring this up, because that was the point that I was hinting at with Coudenhove, who was always skeptical of the League of Nations. And then Abyssinia happens, and then all of a sudden he realizes, if we don't support the League, we don't have anything. So we need to support it. So, I mean, Coudenhove has sort of, if you talk about democratic credentials, it's a bit dubious, but he becomes much more democratic after Abyssinia. It's sort of like better late than never, I guess. But it's very interesting because also in the British context, I'm also forgetting names now. I think I've slept too much. Because in the what's his speaking of functionalist with an M. What is that? Yes, thank you. You see that wave in the late 30s where people start to explore European cooperation. And that's to some extent the same in the Netherlands. They also start late, a bit earlier, because after Britain starts with imperial preference, they lose their faith in Britain. But you see that there are these turning points where they realize we need to do something, because otherwise everything comes apart. I don't know why I'm quoting Achebe here, but
No.
fall apart.
Anybody else?
But I completely take your point. Yeah.
Anybody else? Tommaso.
Thank you.
Dr. Milani is possibly the leading expert on integrated planning.
No, I thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask you to perhaps elaborate a bit on an interesting phenomenon, that in my view sort of affected at the time the idea of Eurafrica and also the appeal of Eurafrica among different people. It seems to me that this idea attracted, on the one hand, certain politicians, intellectuals, diplomats who were interested in exploiting colonies more efficiently without sort of generating conflicts among European powers. So these were usually people with vivid memories of crisis before 1914 that could have brought about a global war because of what happened in Africa, for instance. But on the other hand, Eurafrica also attracted people on the moderate left who sort of weren't really wholly committed to imperial projects, but were also uncomfortable for different reasons with the idea of a quick decolonization. So this is also the time, I mean, the 1920s and 30s, when socialist, social democratic parties started getting into power, usually in coalition governments. And even though they were not generally allowed to conduct foreign affairs, but nevertheless had to elaborate some kind of foreign policy and to incorporate a foreign policy in their party programs and platforms. And so you had like this huge amount of politicians from countries such as the UK, Belgium, even Italy, who are supposed to represent, views that are suitable to countries who hold colonies or dominions and so on. But they want to pursue a kind of more progressive foreign policy that happens also to be, according to their standards, realistic. And so if you don't want to be like committed to imperialism, but you don't believe you can achieve decolonization in the short run, you may start playing with ideas such as Eurafrica or like development for Africa. And what I found interesting about this is that some of these people later on in the 40s and 50s, they support decolonization, but they especially support Pan-Africanism because they don't believe that Africa would benefit from breaking down into small nation states that might conflict with each other. So I just wanted to ask you whether you found any sort of significant evidence that one of the reasons why Eurafrica didn't go mainstream but became more popular than other ideas is because it had this kind of twofold appeal, like right-wingers on the one end and moderate leftists on the other. Thank you.
Thanks, Master. Any more? Answer this one while people are thinking.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderfully laid out. The fear of the Balkanization of Africa, which is an idea that also Senghor put forward. Like, we don't want to be Balkanized, and like the work of Frederick Cooper, who shows these federations in Africa. So actually, I would actually say that possibly the success of Eurafrica is not just rests on twofold things, but actually threefold, because you also have colonial politicians who use it initially as a vehicle to get more rights, the point about that I made before about Senghor, but also who sometimes argue, and I think that's, for example, a difference between Senghor and Nkrumah, for example. And I mean, you talked about Pan-Africanism, so that goes slightly against this, but Nkrumah, very much this Pan-African idea, but he very much pointed out, seek ye the political kingdom first, and then economics will follow. Senghor, and this goes back to the discussions in Europe in a way, is it politics or economics first? And Senghor thought, well, as long as we're part of the polity, they have to listen to us and we can have a say and we can make them do stuff. And he was very good at that. So for him, being part of this, some sort of French polity, which was becoming more equal, was a way to achieve, I think, very similar goals to what Nkrumah more or less had in mind, a more equal position of these African territories in the world, and also in the world economy. And Nkrumah thought, well, we first become independent, and then the economics will follow. And Senghor went the other way, and which is something you also see within the new international economic order. So I think if you're talking about the success of Eurafrica after the Second World War, it's probably these three things coming together. And in addition to what you were saying about these sort of moderate left, there are the people who the third force people, and I guess that's also. I mean, we've corresponded about this, and I think that is also a strand that is quite prominent into keeping this there.
Okay, I thought I saw a hand over here. No, okay. Anybody else? I feel free. Did many of you find this contemporary? Yeah. But quite a few people nodding. Please say why you found it contemporary. There's no escape in when
Hi, I'm Gabriela Martinez. I guess I found it contemporary. I'm taking a class right now on just EU leadership, like contemporarily. So I found it very interesting to look at these different conversations of how, I guess, a cooperative Europe was thought or I guess like the beginnings of it in context with now when we're seeing people talk about, varying degrees of cooperation, whether that's either increasing cooperation, decreasing cooperation, and especially trying to think through, like you were saying earlier, how after a time of, contention, these kind of thoughts of instead of turning towards nationalism, we turn toward cooperation. So I guess it just got me thinking of kind of what were the ideas that maybe we can try to re-bring up to maybe start, whether that's, your opinion or not, like how we can try and replicate that maybe kind of now and how to use some of those ideas to maybe fight against this very heavy push towards nationalism and like secularism that we're kind of seeing now. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there is the title of an article by Pio Hansen, Nasser as the Federator of Europe. I mean, like at a certain point, it seemed that you could also put Trump there as the Federator of Europe. And we'll see also with the war whether this defense community is finally going to happen. I mean, they're like having an outside threat does tend to bring people together.
But don't you think we're thinking in continents again?
Oh yeah, but yeah, I was going to say have we stopped, but maybe that's just me.
No, don't stop. Please, again.
Yeah, no, to add to that, there was, of course, the quote of one of the French thinkers about how Europe should view Africa. And for example, they said, well, Congo supplies the rubber for our cars. I mean, today it's also kind of true, but it's also the Congo supplies the gold and the metals for our phones. So you mentioned, Gabriella, what we could bring back from that political thinking is also worth mentioning in these times where some academics make the comparison to the 30s. What thinking we should still leave behind before we fall back in these neo-colonial tendencies of seeing Europe as, okay, seeing African-European relations still as, okay, we can still extract resources, which we can use for bringing up a European, I don't know, data revolution, technological projects, AI revolution. These are still also questions that need to be discussed.
If I may bring in Italy, Giorgia Meloni is following a policy called the Mattei Plan, which people should take seriously, whether they like it or not. And she quite explicitly argues, and I wrote it down deliberately, that Europe and Africa are complementary. Right.
Fascinating. Yeah. But like if you hear about the global gateway, but also the Chinese Belt and Road, I mean, it's all these sort of projections of Africa as empty or I don't know what. And we tend not to think, and it could be Africa, but like the quote also referred to the Andes. If we think about nitrate and Chile, also very essential for the green revolution, which is necessary, but still, what is the impact these policies have on local communities and local environments elsewhere in the world? So yeah, very much agree with your point.
Yes, please.
I had a question, but I'm not really certain it's related. And I was thinking just because we're talking about the contemporary side of things, and I was thinking about
debate.
well, I'm going to try anyway, about the Union for the Mediterranean, because I felt like it was kind of, it made me think about it because we were talking about the European Union and the engagement with Africa. And I was kind of curious because you have like this European project, this European consolidation that tries to emerge and project itself within like Northern African countries and to transform the political landscape. And I was kind of curious because that will kind of like reminded me of your argument. But on the other hand, it's also kind of different in the idea where you have this transformative approach, which is kind of the complementary point that you were mentioning, but it is also kind of a fusioning approach in some sort that I felt was a bit, I don't know, like I can't quite wrap my head around this, but just it made me think about it and I was kind of confused.
I think you had your hand up as well, right?
Abuse your control of the microphone.
Exactly. But it actually it goes back to a couple of questions before and to the comment from Professor Gilbert on that we are starting again to think like continentally. That I think it's surprising. It doesn't take that long to notice that even just by scrolling on Instagram or on TikTok, the amount of content, right-wing content about a united Europe, it's increasing. And I think this is something that lacks a lot in the political discourse and also in the academic one, because there is kind of this cliche of right-wing and then being Euroscepticism. Whereas now I think that among young people, those who use TikTok and Instagram, and with all due respect, actually it's gaining ground much more, this idea, which is essentially like race with racist connotations of united Europe against is against migration and the influence about migrating culture, especially from Middle East and North Africa. So yes, in this sense, I really think that this lecture is really actual and contemporary.
Yeah, thank you for both those points. Maybe just to start with the last one. I think I mentioned this in your class. I started teaching a course in 2013 for the MA European Union Studies, which is part of the MAIR in Leiden, on Euroscepticism, and also look at more historical literature, which was almost non-existent at the time. That has changed, which is good from a historiographical point of view. But it was then very much that the Eurosceptics were, on the one hand, using Europe. I mean, Farage is the best example. If it hadn't been for the European Parliament, there would no way he would have risen to the position he had. But at the same time, it was still, Europe was a bulwark against this. And I think what we're seeing now, especially with very Eurosceptic, well, more right-wing and to a certain extent Eurosceptic, but in a different sense than when we used it before, leaders being elected in a number of countries, you see that the European Union is moving much more in that direction. And so when before it was a bulwark against this, it can also be a force for it. And I think that's also what you're alluding to. And I think that is very much a change that indeed is perhaps not something we talk about enough. I mean, in Dutch newspapers, it does come up every now and then. And also if you look at the links between Meloni and Wilders and Orban and et cetera, you see these networks, but whether it has really sort of settled, like, okay, this is something that is now happening, I wonder if that has been sunk in enough. Your question, could you repeat what you were explained a little bit further, because you were talking about the current situation, what the EU was doing in North Africa and the military. And I wasn't quite sure the relationship between the military and North Africa. No,
Did I say the word military?
Oh, did you not say the word military? Maybe that explains my confusion. But you were talking about North Africa.
Yeah, I was talking about the Union for the Mediterranean, and I was wondering.
Mediterranean. Sorry. Okay. Yes.
I know, I was just a bit wondering because we were talking about the role of like Europe and Africa and the complementarity / the use and the way Europe could view Africa and the way Africa plays a part in the construction of Europe as an entity, as a political entity. And I was comparing it with other political entity notions, that is the Union for the Mediterranean, and the way it's also used in a way Europe trying to foster a specific political environment at its gates by trying to spread democracy, to put it in a in a specific way, to put it that way.
No, I understand what you're saying. I'm a little bit skeptic about how the EU is trying to spread democracy, particularly in Northern Africa. If you think about what they're trying to do to keep migrants out of Europe, I don't think that has a lot to do with democracy. Your point about the union of the Mediterranean Union, that fits very well with this. And I think maybe connecting it a bit further, and that's something I didn't really talk about. Now, the EU, Fortress Europe, is very much about keeping other people out. In the interwar period, why was Eurafrica interesting was also because it would be a terrain where we could ship migrants. And this was a way to let off the pressure, particularly in Italy, but also in Germany, and sort of social tension in Europe would decrease as long as we could get people out, and there would be less employment in Europe, and these people could go and work in Africa. African politicians were very much against this because they were afraid that either these Europeans would take the most valuable terrains in Africa. I mean, the idea that Africa is empty is not true. Or they would take not the best terrains, but other terrains, and all the energy would go into these terrains and nothing would be left for African populations. So even though the dynamic has shifted, like has been reversed in terms of where people are going, it's still very much part of the same conversation. And also the purported aims of this Mediterranean Union of spreading democracy. I mean, you could see that in the same vein as this whole idea we need to bring development to the colonies, and that can be very right-wing or very exploitative, as you were pointing out. It can also be the other side of what you were pointing out, and more these left-wing people who feel that they had a duty, like we've been involved there, we can't just leave it. I mean, that would be adding insult to injury. So, you know, for the best reasons, terrible things happen, obviously. So I think some of these people were genuinely thinking that this was really in the best interest of the colonized peoples. And I guess there is a similar dynamic in thinking about, okay, it's the burden of the EU to do certain things. And that's a very difficult discussion, because as one of my students a few years ago said, you know, that we were having a discussion, you know, what right does the EU have to talk about human rights in Africa, particularly given its history? Now, there is a long debate about human rights and how universal they are. I am more of the school that they are universal. But even then, what is the position of the EU? What right do they have to say you should do it this way? And then one of the students said, but, you know, what if you're gay in Uganda? Then it's quite nice if the EU says, well, actually, also gay people have rights. And it's a very difficult discussion. And I think, so there are people who do things with the best intentions, and there are people who see it in much more extractive terms. But even with the best intentions, it's a very difficult discussion.
And
Anyway.
politics should be a difficult discussion, as should academia. I think we should thank our speakers tonight for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
See you all next time. Thank you.